Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film. May your story starts here. The Amazing Spider-Man story and review. Gwen later pulls Peter aside for a private moment and tells him it took real guts to stand up to Flash. The compliment throws him off guard, and for the first time all day, he actually cracks a smile. That evening, while helping Uncle Ben clear out the basement, Peter stumbles on an old briefcase that belonged to his father. He examines it closely and finds a hidden compartment built into the case, packed with documents tied to Richard Parker's scientific research. Digging through the papers, Peter learns his father once worked at Oscorp alongside a scientist named Dr. Curt Connors. Hungry for more answers, he goes online and discovers that Richard specialized in cross-species genetics, experimental work focused on blending traits from different organisms. His search also turns up news reports confirming that both his parents died in a plane crash. Still craving answers, Peter shows up at Oscorp the next day. With no legitimate way in, he poses as another student who'd been invited to an intern orientation and slips inside using stolen credentials. Once there, he's stunned to run into Gwen, not just visiting, but actually working as one of Dr. Connors' senior interns. She spots him immediately and asks what he's doing there. Peter fumbles out an excuse about always loving science. She clearly doesn't buy it, but rather than turning him in, she quietly warns him to be careful. While wandering the facility, Peter notices a man carrying files stamped with the same odd symbols he'd seen in his father's documents. Sensing a connection, he trails the employee to a restricted lab focused on biochemical development. Once the man leaves, Peter sneaks inside and finds a massive experiment involving genetically altered spiders, suspended in an elaborate web-like rig. Intrigued, he reaches out and tugs at one of the strands, and the whole setup collapses, sending spiders raining down on him. He panics and swats them away, not realizing one has crawled under his collar. Before he can get out of the lab, it bites him on the back of the neck. On the subway ride home, Peter starts feeling off. A group of men decide to mess with him, expecting an easy target, but his body reacts on its own. His reflexes are suddenly lightning fast, letting him dodge every punch without even trying. He has no idea how he's moving like this. His strength and coordination have both spiked dramatically, and he takes the whole group down with almost no effort. What should have been a scary situation turns into a strange, chaotic blur of abilities he never knew he had. Back home, Peter checks himself in the mirror and finds the spider still stuck to the bite mark on his neck. Realizing it must have come from the Oscorp lab, he starts to suspect the bite changed him somehow. By morning, there's no doubt his senses are sharper. He's faster, stronger, and has balance and reflexes that feel almost spider-like. Even simple movements now take real concentration, since he hasn't learned to control his new strength yet. Eager to learn more about his father's work, Peter visits Dr. Connors at home and introduces himself as Richard Parker's son. Connors is floored. He never expected to meet the child of his old research partner. Once it sinks in who Peter is, he explains that he and Richard had been working on cross-species genetic regeneration, using animal traits to regrow damaged human tissue, even severed limbs. For Connors, the project is personal. He lost his right arm years ago and has always dreamed of a treatment that could restore it. But Richard vanished before they could finish the work, and without his calculations, Connors was stuck for years. Peter suddenly remembers a formula tucked among his father's papers. He copies it down and hands it over. Connors studies it and realizes almost instantly that it might be the missing piece they needed. Amazed, he agrees to keep talking with Peter, and the two plan to meet again the next day. Back at school, Flash is in the middle of a basketball game when he deliberately dumps ink on a girl's schoolwork. Peter steps in to help her clean up, and when a stray ball comes flying at them, he snatches it out of the air with one hand. Flash comes over to grab the ball back, but instead of backing down like usual, Peter decides to use his new powers to embarrass him. He keeps the ball just out of reach, dodging and spinning around the court while everyone watches in shock. For once, Flash is the one humiliated. But Peter loses control mid-showdown and accidentally wrecks the basketball hoop and backboard. Uncle Ben gets called into school over the damage and the apparent scuffle. He's disappointed to hear Peter's been accused of bullying another student with sheer physical force. Without knowing the real story, Ben still feels Peter should have handled it better. Before they part, he reminds Peter that Aunt May gets off work later that night and asks him to pick her up. Peter agrees, but his mind is already on his secret meetings with Dr. Connors. On the way to Oscorp, Peter tests the limits of his transformed body, sprinting across rooftops, leaping between buildings, and working through impromptu park routines through the city. With every movement, he grows more confident. At Oscorp, Dr. Connors uses Peter's formula to run a regeneration test on a lab mouse missing a limb. After administering the treatment, the two watch in amazement as the mouse's limb begins regrowing. How the experiment actually works. Caught up in the excitement, Peter loses track of time and comes home late to find Uncle Ben waiting outside. Furious, Peter suddenly remembers he was supposed to pick up Aunt May, who had to find her own way home. During the argument, Ben brings up Richard, explaining that Peter's father believed strongly that having the power to help someone came with the responsibility to actually do it. Peter snaps back, asking what any of that means now, since his father abandoned him and isn't even around anymore. Furious, he storms out before Ben can respond. Aunt May tells her husband to let the boy cool off on his own, but Ben refuses to leave him wandering the streets and goes after him. Still seething, Peter stops at a convenience store to buy milk but comes up short on cash. The cashier won't budge on the price and sends him away empty-handed. Moments later, another customer pulls a gun, robs their register, and bolts. The thief brushes right past Peter, but still stung by the cashier's treatment, Peter does nothing to stop him. Outside, Uncle Ben spots the fleeing robber while searching for Peter and tries to intervene, grabbing hold of him. In the struggle, the gun fires. Ben collapses on the pavement as the thief disappears into the night. Hearing the commotion, Peter rushes toward the gathering crowd and finds his uncle lying motionless. He kneels beside him, but it's too late. Ben is already gone. The loss devastates Peter. Ben wasn't just an uncle, he was Peter's closest friend, father figure, and one of the only people who truly cared about him. Knowing he could have stopped the robber only deepens the guilt. Peter withdraws into himself, sinking into grief. The next day at school, Flash approaches him, and Peter, bracing for another confrontation, grabs him and shoves him against a locker. But Flash doesn't fight back this time. He quietly says he just wanted to offer his condolences about Uncle Ben. The unexpected kindness leaves Peter unsure how to respond. Gwen tries to comfort him too, wrapping her arms around him gently, but the grief runs too deep, and even her warmth can't reach him. That night, wandering the city alone, Peter runs into a group of criminals in a rough part of town. His anger flares as he thinks about Ben's murder, and he picks a fight, using his enhanced strength, reflexes, and parkour skills to take them down with ease, flipping over obstacles, dodging strikes, launching across the alley. Mid-fight, he makes another discovery. When thrown against a wall, his hands and feet stick to the surface, letting him climb without falling. From that point on, Peter tests his new wall-crawling ability across the city and starts hunting criminals every night. Obsessed with finding Ben's killer, he tracks down men matching the thief's description and interrogates them after taking them down. What begins as a personal revenge mission slowly turns into something bigger. He starts stopping robberies and violent attacks, unintentionally protecting ordinary people along the way. Word of the mysterious masked vigilante starts spreading through the city. During one chase, Peter crashes through the roof of an abandoned wrestling arena and lands in the old ring, where he spots a discarded wrestler's mask. It gives him an idea if he's going to keep operating at night. He needs to hide his identity from criminals, witnesses, and cops alike. He starts with a basic face covering and keeps refining it, eventually building a flexible spandex suit that won't restrict his movement, along with mechanical web shooters that strap to his wrists. The shooters fire a specially engineered fluid that forms incredibly strong strands. After plenty of practice, Peter learns to swing between buildings using the webbing, gliding above the streets. With the full suit, mask, and gear complete, he takes on a new public identity and residents start calling him Spider-Man, thanks to the way he scales walls and swings across the skyline. Not everyone's a fan. The police view Spider-Man as a reckless vigilante interfering with investigations and dispensing his own brand of justice. Captain George Stacy, a Gwen's father and a senior officer, leads the effort to track him down. One night, Spider-Man catches a thief and toys with him instead of turning him in right away, joking while the man dangles helplessly in webbing. Before he can finish, police surround him with weapons drawn and order him to surrender. Peter refuses, uses his speed to slip past them, and swings away by firing a web at a nearby building. Meanwhile, pressure builds on Dr. Connors inside Oscorp. His boss, Dr. Rajit Rather, wants to push the regeneration serum straight into human trials, arguing it could soon let amputees and injured patients regrow limbs. Connors objects how the mouse experiment worked, but the serum hasn't been tested nearly enough to guarantee it's safe for people. He refuses to gamble with lives just to hit Oscorp's deadlines. Rather has no patience for this, pulls Connors off the project, fires him, and seizes control of the formula, determined to push ahead with human trials regardless. Devastated at losing both his job and his research, Connors goes home in despair. Years of frustration over his missing arm, combined with fear that his work is about to be stolen from him, drive him to a reckless decision. He injects himself with the untested serum. The drug knocks him unconscious. When he wakes up, his missing right arm has completely regrown. His joy is short-lived, though. The serum triggers severe changes throughout his body. His skin hardens, his features warp, and his size balloons. Within moments, he transforms into a massive reptilian creature, driven by raw strength and animal instinct. Now fully changed, the creature sets out after Dr. Rather, determined to stop him from using the serum on human subjects. Around this time, Peter's invited to dinner at Gwen's house, where he meets her family and sits across from Captain Stacy. Conversation turns to Spider-Man, and Stacy openly criticizes the vigilante, arguing that a masked individual shouldn't get to decide who's guilty or ignore the law whenever he pleases, insisting the police will catch him eventually. Peter can't stay quiet and defends Spider-Man as someone trying to protect people the police can't always reach in time. The exchange makes for an uncomfortable dinner, with neither man realizing how personally invested the other actually is. Afterward, Peter and Gwen step onto the terrace. She senses he's hiding something and presses him to explain his strange behavior. Instead of talking around it, Peter shows her he's Spider-Man, proving it with a quick demonstration of his abilities. Gwen is stunned but takes it in, and the moment shifts something between them. Peter admits how much he cares for her, and they kiss. Their moment is cut short when Captain Stacy gets an emergency call about a dangerous creature attacking people near the Williamsburg Bridge. He rushes out, and Peter secretly follows. At the bridge, Peter finds the massive reptilian monster hurling cars off the roadway, sending traffic into chaos. He suits up and starts firing webs to anchor falling vehicles and pull people to safety. Connors spots Spider-Man arriving but backs off before Peter can identify him and escapes. Peter then learns a young boy is trapped in a car dangling below the bridge. suspended only by webbing. He climbs down and enters the unstable vehicle, but the terrified child won't budge, overwhelmed by the height and the masked stranger. Realizing the mask is scaring the boy further, Peter takes it off and hands it to him, telling him it'll make him brave. The gesture works, say Peter guides the boy out and reunites him with his father moments before the car falls. Despite his heroics on the bridge, police issue an official arrest warrant for Spider-Man the next morning. Peter's crushed. He's risked his life for strangers, and the authorities still treat him like a criminal. Still suspicious about the creature, he visits Dr. Connors' office to ask what kind of reptile could have caused the attack. Connors looks exhausted and unwell but tries to stay composed, offering a vague explanation about a genetically altered reptile acting aggressively out of fear before quickly cutting the conversation short, claiming he's busy with a new project. Peter spots a container used for the regeneration serum nearby, and between that, Connors' strange behavior, and his newly regrown arm, he pieces together the truth. Connors didn't just create the drug, he injected himself and became the creature. Determined to stop another attack, Peter goes to the police station and tells Captain Stacy that Dr. Connors is behind the Williamsburg Bridge chaos, explaining that Connors used reptile DNA to try to regrow his arm and something went horribly wrong. Stacy finds the story too far-fetched and dismisses it without investigating. With the police unwilling to help, Peter decides to handle Connors himself and starts searching the city's sewer system, guessing the creature might be hiding underground. He sets up a hidden camera hoping to catch proof, and it doesn't take long before Connors shows up, transforming once again into the towering lizard. A brutal fight breaks out in the cramped tunnels. Peter tries to keep his distance using speed and webbing, but the tight space limits his options, and Connors' transformed body proves far stronger. He slams Peter repeatedly into walls and pipes. Mid-battle, Peter's web shooters malfunction and stop working, stripping him of his main advantage. The lizard pins him down, ready to strike, but Peter barely manages to break free and disappear deeper into the tunnels. After Peter flees, Connors finds the abandoned camera and discovers Peter Parker's name on it, instantly realizing the vigilante interfering with his plans is Richard Parker's son. Injured, Peter climbs into Gwen's bedroom that night. Shocked at his condition, she cleans and bandages his wounds while he confesses he feels responsible for everything. Connors couldn't finish the regeneration experiment until Peter handed him Richard's missing equation, and that formula is what turned him into a monster. Peter believes that since he helped create the problem, he has to be the one to fix it. The next day, things spiral further. Connors, transformed, storms into Peter's school, sending students and teachers fleeing in terror as he hunts specifically for Peter. Peter suits up and dodges the creature's attacks with his webs as their fight tears through classrooms, hallways, and the library. Despite Connor's brute strength, Peter uses his intelligence and whatever's around him to fight back, repeatedly forcing the creature away from students before Connors escapes ahead of arriving police. Knowing another attack is coming, Peter has Gwen head back to Oscorp to prepare an antidote using Connors' research while he searches the sewer hideout himself. There, he uncovers Connors' real plan. He no longer wants the serum just for himself, he intends to release it across the entire city, turning every resident into a reptilian creature. In his altered mental state, Connors sees this as a kind of evolution that would eliminate illness, disability, and weakness. His plan is to disperse it through a cloud-generating machine at the top of Oscorp Tower. Realizing time is short, Peter calls Gwen and tells her to leave the lab immediately, since Connors is already heading to Oscorp and she'd be directly in his path. Meanwhile, police split their forces between hunting the lizard and continuing to pursue Spider-Man. Captain Stacy still treats him as a threat even with a monster loose in the city. One tactical unit corners Connors and brings him down with heavy weapons fire, but his rapid healing lets him recover almost instantly. and during the struggle he infects several officers with the chemical, giving them reptilian features. Elsewhere, Captain Stacy's team surrounds Spider-Man, and during the struggle, part of his mask comes off, revealing his face. Stacy is stunned to realize the vigilante he's been chasing is his daughter's classmate. Peter urgently explains that Connors is heading for Oscorp Tower and that Gwen is inside preparing the only antidote that can stop him, warning that if the lizard reaches the dispersal machine, the whole city will be infected. Stacy, hesitant but convinced, lets him go. As Peter tries to leave, an officer accidentally shoots him in the leg, badly limiting his mobility. Every swing now sends pain shooting through his body. Still, he pushes on toward Oscorp, knowing no one else can stop Connors in time. The father of the boy Peter saved on the bridge, a construction worker, recognizes Spider-Man on the news and realizes he's the one struggling to reach the tower. Wanting to repay him, the man rallies nearby crane operators to rotate their machines into a straight line toward Oscorp, creating a series of platforms Peter can use to swing across the city. Traffic police clear the streets below, with the whole city suddenly helping instead of hunting him. Peter closes the distance to the tower crane by crane. Inside the lab, Gwen finishes the antidote just before Connors arrives, escapes with the container, and finds her father. She hands it over, telling him Spider-Man needs it before the lizard can activate the machine. Captain Stacy rushes to the top of the tower, arriving as Connors is already overpowering the wounded Peter near the dispersal device. Stacy opens fire, forcing the creature back just long enough to hand Peter the antidote, buying him time to climb toward the machine and swap out the containers. As Peter works, Stacy keeps shooting to hold Connors off until the lizard turns and slashes him, leaving him critically wounded. Connors then climbs after Peter, reaching the top just as Peter finishes the swap and activates the machine with the antidote instead of the mutagenic serum. A massive cloud spreads across the city, but instead of spreading the mutation, it reverses it. The infected officers return to normal, and Connors transforms back into an ordinary man. As the damaged structure collapses beneath him, Peter loses his grip and starts to fall, but Connors, now human again and horrified by what he nearly caused, catches him before he hits the ground. Once safe, Peter rushes to Captain Stacy, who's still alive but fatally wounded. In his final moments, Stacy admits the city genuinely needs Spider-Man, even knowing the role will make Peter powerful enemies. Worried specifically about Gwen's safety, he asks Peter to promise he'll stay away from her to keep her out of danger. Peter reluctantly agrees. After Stacy's death, Peter keeps his word, distancing himself from Gwen without explanation and even skipping the captain's funeral out of fear that staying close to her would put her at risk. Gwen is hurt by his sudden coldness but eventually realizes what happened. Her father must have asked this of him before he died, and, though it pains her, she accepts his decision. Sometime later at school, Flash approaches Peter again, now this time with none of the old hostility, now treating him like a friend and even wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, completely unaware the hero he admires is standing right in front of him. Peter compliments the shirt, quietly amused. In the final scene, Spider-Man watches from high above the city as police cars race through the streets chasing a criminal. No longer driven purely by revenge for Uncle Ben, he now understands the weight of responsibility that comes with his powers, and fires a web toward the next rooftop, swinging off after them, fully embracing who he's become. Review: the biggest hurdle facing the Amazing Spider-Man shows up before Peter Parker even gets bitten. Why tell this story again? Sam Raimi's original trilogy had wrapped up barely 5 years earlier, and its first installment had premiered only a decade before this reboot. This wasn't a character returning to screens after a long absence. Audiences still vividly remembered the last Spider-Bite, the last Uncle Ben, the last costume, the last responsibility speech. None of it had faded into cinematic history. so the film has to work against a built-in sense of copyright avoo. We already know the shape of the story. Peter enters a lab, gets bitten, starts acting strangely, Uncle Ben dies, guilt sets in, a mask eventually shows up. The specifics might shift, but the destination is never really in doubt. That alone doesn't doom the movie. Familiar stories can absolutely still land. Batman's origin has been retold again and again. Superman's mythology keeps getting reshaped for new generations, and even ancient myths endure because each new storyteller finds a fresh angle into material we already know by heart. The trouble here is that the Amazing Spider-Man often swaps out the decoration without meaningfully changing the experience underneath. Mary Jane becomes Gwen Stacy, the Green Goblin becomes the Lizard, organic webs become mechanical shooters. Peter rides a skateboard now, wears different clothes, and the lighting turns moodier, but we're still watching him move through many of the same emotional beats the earlier films already covered. It's a strange tension. The movie wants to feel like a clean break, yet it leans hard on our familiarity with the character, wanting credit for being different while constantly reminding us how much of the underlying structure hasn't changed at all. There are stretches where the new approach nearly justifies itself. The mystery of Peter's parents gives him a fresh reason for entering Oscorp. Gwen gets a far more active role than love interests usually receive in origin stories. Andrew Garfield brings a noticeably different energy to Peter than Tobey Maguire did. And once the mask goes on, his performance turns sharper, looser, more sarcastic. Those choices give the film its own flavor. This isn't simply a repeat of the 2002 movie with a new cast, but it's close enough that the comparison never fully disappears. You can practically feel the film trying to outrun the memory of Raimi's version, leaning into darker colors, grittier technology, and a more grounded emotional register. Peter's powers come with visible physical cost. He bruises, he stumbles, his movements feel like improvisation rather than polished heroics. Say someone genuinely working out a body he doesn't understand yet. That texture is a real asset. But texture alone doesn't answer the question of necessity. The film reportedly carried a massive budget, and it shows that the effects are slick. The city looks fantastic, and Spider-Man moves in ways that simply weren't achievable a decade earlier. Even so, the whole project keeps feeling tethered to franchise upkeep rather than any pressing creative urge. The business logic is obvious. Spider-Man is one of the most recognizable characters on the planet, and no studio was going to let him sit dormant. There were sequels to plan, villains to introduce, mysteries to seed, an entire cinematic universe waiting in the wings. None of that means director Marc Webb lacked genuine artistic intent. His focus on Peter's loneliness and relationships comes through clearly, and the cast brings real care to their performances. But the film never fully sheds the sense of a valuable property being restarted simply because it's too valuable to leave alone. And that matters because it colors how we experience the origin story. Uncle Ben's death is supposed to be devastating. It's the emotional core of Peter's entire life. But here, part of the audience can't help thinking, we've already been through this. That's not entirely the film's fault, but it's a burden it chose to take on. There's something a little tiring about watching a second version carefully rearrange the exact same pieces. Peter argues with Ben, storms out, crosses paths with a criminal, makes a selfish call, tragedy strikes. The emotional beats still work in places. Martin Sheen gives Uncle Ben real warmth, but the machinery behind them is now visible, and the audience can see each scene coming before it lands. Some viewers won't mind at all. Longtime fans might enjoy seeing comic-accurate details restored, like the web shooters and Peter's sharper wits, treating the reboot less as repetition and more as correction. Others will wonder why those adjustments required an entire restart. That divide probably explains why reactions to this film run so hot and cold. One person sees a fresher, livelier Spider-Man, another sees a glossier remake of something still fresh in memory. Both readings hold up. Personally, I'd place the movie somewhere in the middle. It has too much personality to dismiss as an empty cash grab. Garfield and Emma Stone bring their own chemistry, the effects are genuinely stronger, the romance has its own rhythm, and the parental mystery hints at new territory. But the film never quite proves those elements needed an entirely new origin story to exist. That's really the crux of it. A new Spider-Man movie was an easy sell. A full retelling of how he became Spider-Man was a much harder case to make. The film could have opened with Peter already active as the hero, trusted audiences to know the basics, and revealed the parental mystery gradually while exploring new ground. Instead, it goes back to square one and spends much of its runtime rebuilding a character who never really left. Once Spider-Man is finally swinging through the city, though, the movie gets easier to enjoy. Garfield's physical performance sets itself apart from Maguire's, the action picks up speed, and the wisecracks start flowing. For stretches, the question of whether the reboot was necessary fades into the background, replaced by whether the movie is simply funny, and often, it is. That might be enough for a summer blockbuster, and maybe even enough for comic fans hoping for a version closer to the source material. But being watchable and being necessary aren't the same thing. The film's real opponent isn't the lizard, it's recognition. Every familiar beat is a reminder that we've already seen another filmmaker solve this exact problem, often with more warmth and a clearer identity. The Amazing Spider-Man survives that comparison well enough. It's not a disaster, and it's more competent than its harshest critics suggest. Strong performances, impressive effects, and enough interesting swaps to avoid feeling like a shot-for-shot copy. What it never quite shakes is the sense that the reboot came first and the creative justification was assembled afterward. The studio needed Spider-Man back on screens. The filmmakers then had to find a reason for audiences to sit through the beginning all over again. Sometimes they find one, sometimes they don't. That uncertainty runs through the whole movie. Peter Parker, Reimage, and this version of Peter is where the reboot makes its riskiest bet. Andrew Garfield isn't playing the same awkward outsider Tobey Maguire embodied. He's still lonely, still sharp, still carrying the wound of being abandoned by his parents, but he doesn't look or act like the invisible kid at school. He skateboards through the halls, dresses with at least a little style, carries a camera around, and has a slightly aloof coolness that tends to draw attention rather than deflect it. The film tells us he's an outcast, and there are flashes of that the way he watches Gwen from across a room. His fumbling attempts to talk to her, but he never fully reads as the classically bullied Peter Parker. He comes across more as a guarded, complicated kid who keeps people at arm's length by choice. That distinction actually matters. His isolation traces less to social humiliation and more to abandonment. Peter remembers his parents leaving him with Ben and May, and even though he was young, the feeling never left him. He doesn't know why they vanished, and he hasn't fully accepted that they simply died. Beneath the sarcasm, he's still waiting for an answer, so when he finds his father's briefcase and starts tracing a path toward Connors and Oscorp, it's not idle teenage curiosity. He's searching for a missing piece of himself. That gives the origin story a more personal engine than just wandering into the wrong lab by accident. At the same time, the film sometimes pushes so hard to modernize Peter that it dilutes what made him distinctive. The skateboard is the clearest example. An entire stretch has him using it to test his new coordination, and while the intent is understandable, it's visual, youthful, gives Garfield something physical to do before the suit shows up. It also feels like a note from a studio meeting insisting Peter needed to look more current. His personality follows a similar pattern. Even before the bite, Garfield's Peter isn't especially meek. He stands up for a bullied classmate, breaks rules, talks back to adults, takes risks. He's nervous around Gwen, sure, but he's never naturally passive. Once the bite happens, all of that gets amplified. The discovery of his powers plays out as a mix of comedy, panic, and real physical confusion. On the subway, he can't control his strength, sticks to surfaces without meaning to, reacts before he can think. It works because he's not instantly graceful. He looks like a teenager trapped inside a body that's suddenly rewritten its own rules. Then the thrill takes over. He starts climbing, testing his balance, realizing almost nothing can physically hurt him anymore. There's a real rush to those scenes, and you can tell Peter is enjoying it, maybe a little too much, which makes the powers feel less like an instant path to heroism and more like an invitation to recklessness. His showdown with Flash on the basketball court is a good example. Instead of walking away, he humiliates him publicly, using abilities nobody else understands to settle a personal score. It plays like a revenge fantasy, and there's something a little uncomfortable buried in it. Peter's gone from powerless to absurdly overpowered, and his first instinct isn't responsibility, it's payback. Believable, if not exactly admirable. The problem is the film sometimes treats his behavior with a lightness that clashes with what it's ultimately trying to say. Peter wrecks property, humiliates Flash, and acts as if the rules no longer apply to him. And Uncle Ben notices the shift before Peter does, calling out the arrogance and anger and the way Peter's pulling away from the people who actually care about him. Their arguments rank among the film's better scenes, largely because Martin Sheen never plays Ben like a man delivering a rehearsed speech. He sounds like a genuinely frustrated parent trying to explain that Richard believed people had obligations to one another, especially when they had the power to help. The idea's there. What's missing is the line everyone's waiting for: with great power comes great responsibility. A film doesn't have to repeat a famous phrase just because audiences know it. And there's nothing inherently wrong with expressing the same idea differently, but that specific line isn't just a quotable moment, it's the cleanest possible statement of Spider-Man's entire moral identity. Without it, the film has to work much harder to make Peter's transformation land. Early on, he's not using his powers to protect strangers. He's exploring, showing off, and eventually hunting for Ben's killer. He isn't patrolling New York out of civic duty. He's chasing men who match the description of the thief who got away, which makes this version of Spider-Man much closer to a grief-fueled vigilante. There's real anger in how he takes down criminals, and he seems to enjoy scaring them. Garfield is genuinely funny in these scenes, but the humor has an edge. The mask lets Peter say things he'd never say at school, and he becomes louder, cockier, more aggressive. In some ways that's actually close to the comics. Spider-Man is supposed to talk trash during fights, distract opponents, mask his fear with jokes, and Garfield nails that part of the character. Once the suit goes on, his whole performance loosens. A lighter body language, more confidence in his voice. He finally seems free. But freedom isn't the same thing as maturity, and the film's real challenge is showing how this angry kid becomes someone willing to risk his life for total strangers. That arc is present, if not always cleanly executed. The bridge rescue is probably the turning point. Spider-Man isn't chasing one specific criminal or working through guilt anymore. He sees a terrified kid trapped in a car dangling over the water, and there's no personal payoff to helping him. When Peter takes off his mask and hands it to the boy, that small gesture communicates more about responsibility than any of the film's bigger speeches. He understands that being Spider-Man isn't only about what he can do physically, it's about giving another scared person a reason to believe they'll be okay. For once, the mask isn't something Peter hides behind, it becomes something he hands off as a source of courage. It's one of the few moments where the reboot finds a genuinely fresh emotional angle inside such well-worn material. Uncle Ben's death remains the defining wound, of course, but the film handles Peter's grief in a slightly unconventional way. He doesn't spiral into visible mourning for long. His pain comes out as obsession, silence, and violence. He hunts night after night for the killer, ignores Aunt May, comes home injured and offers no explanation. Some viewers might find that emotionally honest. Grief doesn't always look like crying over a photograph. Sometimes it looks like anger and avoidance. Still, the film drops the manhunt thread without resolving it. Peter never actually catches the man responsible. The storyline just fades as the lizard plot takes over, which leaves Peter's shift from vengeance to heroism feeling incomplete. You can see what the film wants us to believe: that he starts selfish, gets pushed by circumstance, and gradually chooses to help people because it's right. But there's no single decisive moment where he confronts the fact that revenge has consumed him. The change happens by accumulation rather than choice. His responsibility toward Connors is far more direct. Peter hands over the equation that makes the regeneration experiment possible, partly out of excitement, partly out of loyalty to his father's legacy, partly out of a hunger for answers, without pausing to consider what could go wrong if the research gets rushed or misused. When Connors injects himself and becomes the lizard, the conflict turns personal in a way the film doesn't always lean into enough. Peter isn't simply the only person capable of stopping the villain. He helped create him. His curiosity, intelligence, and need to understand his father all fed directly into the disaster. This is where the responsibility theme could have hit much harder. Peter's mind is just as dangerous a gift as his powers, and a formula scrawled on paper can do as much damage as a punch thrown in anger. The film gestures at that idea but doesn't dig into it, too busy racing toward its final act. There's also a persistent contradiction in how Peter behaves. He's smart enough to build sophisticated web shooters, parse complex biological research, and trace his father's scientific history, yet emotionally he stays impulsive, revealing his identity to Gwen almost instantly, ignoring warnings, leaping off buildings before he fully understands his own limits. That inconsistency can be frustrating, though it's also recognizably teenage, brilliant in a lab, foolish when it comes to grief, love, or anger. Intelligence doesn't automatically produce judgment. Garfield sells that contradiction better than the script always supports. His Peter is constantly in motion, even mid-conversation, hesitating, stammering, glancing away, then suddenly saying too much. He rarely seems settled in his own skin, even after gaining the ability to crawl straight up a wall. Not everyone will connect with this take. Viewers attached to a more openly vulnerable Peter Parker might find Garfield too confident, too polished, even a little abrasive. He doesn't project the immediate sense of a gentle kid being crushed by the world. At times, he seems like he was already halfway to becoming Spider-Man before the spider ever showed up. But there's something compelling in watching power amplify traits that were already there. Peter is angry before the bite just gives him the means to act on it. He feels abandoned before the bite, the mask gives him another way to hide. He wants answers before the bite, his new abilities let him force his way into places those answers might be waiting. The origin, in other words, isn't really about gaining powers, it's about all of Peter's unresolved emotions becoming more dangerous now that he actually has the ability to act on them. Responsibility arrives gradually, in the moment he saves the boy on the bridge, when he stops treating every criminal as a potential target for revenge, when he decides Connors has to be stopped, when he keeps pushing forward despite a gunshot wound. When Spider-Man becomes less an escape from Peter Parker and more a way of finally doing what Peter Parker couldn't. The film doesn't nail that journey perfectly. It leaves the manhunt unresolved, rushes the moral development, and skips the one line that could have tied it all together. But the core idea survives. This Peter gains power long before he's earned it. He misuses it, enjoys it, hides inside it. Becoming Spider-Man ultimately means realizing that the ability to act comes with an obligation to act well. He gets there just by a messier road than the earlier films took. The parent mystery and Oscorp. The mystery surrounding Peter's parents is probably the reboot's most obvious attempt to carve out its own identity. Rather than treating Richard and Mary Parker as distant background details, The film makes their disappearance central to who Peter is. It opens with them dropping him off at Ben and May's house, visibly frightened and in a hurry, before vanishing from his life entirely. Peter's too young at the time to understand what's happening, but old enough to remember being left behind, and that memory seems to shape nearly everything he does afterward. He's guarded, keeps people at a distance, acts like he doesn't need anyone, which usually means the opposite. Even his interest in science carries an emotional undercurrent. He's not just chasing equations, he's trying to understand his father. The old briefcase becomes his way back into that unresolved chapter of his life. Inside, he finds research tied to Dr. Curt Connors, his father's former Oscorp colleague, and that discovery sends him toward the lab, the spider bite, and ultimately the whole conflict of the film. So this time, the origin isn't purely accidental. Peter doesn't stumble into the wrong room on a random school trip. His search for his parents leads him there. Curiosity gets him through the door, but grief is what's really pushing him forward, which is a smart choice because it ties his powers to something personal before he even gets them. The spider bite becomes just another consequence of his need for answers. In a sense, the entire plot grows out of a kid who never understood why his parents left. The trouble is, the mystery is often more compelling than the answers the film's willing to give. We learn Richard worked with Connors on cross-species genetics. We're told Peter's parents died in a plane crash, though the circumstances stay vague enough to raise doubts. Oscorp clearly knows more than it lets on, with secret files, unfinished research, and people acting as though the Parker name still carries some kind of risk. But the film keeps most of that at arm's length. It's efficient at raising questions. Why did his parents run? What exactly were they working on? Was the crash really an accident? Why is Oscorp still so invested in this research? How much does Connors actually know? Without resolving any of them satisfyingly. It treats these threads partly as emotional backstory and partly as franchise bait. You can feel the film banking information for later installments. That undercuts the mystery, since Peter's search starts out as the reason he enters the story and then quietly becomes secondary once the lizard plot takes over. His parents still matter, but mostly by implication. Curt Connors functions as the bridge between Peter and his father. At first, Peter approaches him almost like a student meeting a piece of family history. Connors knew Richard, worked beside him, and to Peter that makes him more than a scientist. He's a possible witness to the life Peter never got to see. There's something quietly sad in that dynamic. Peter wants knowledge, sure, but he also wants approval. Connors represents the idealized version of his father Peter has built in his head, a brilliant, respected, doing work that could change lives. By helping solve the missing equation, Peter isn't just showing off his intellect, he's stepping into his father's place, briefly becoming part of the work Richard left unfinished. And Peter really is brilliant. How the film emphasizes that more than the earlier movies typically did. His room is packed with equipment, photographs, half-finished devices. He modifies things, grasps difficult research, and spots a path forward on Connors' problem when trained scientists are stuck. The mechanical web shooters are the clearest example of this. Instead of organic webbing, Peter builds a device that fires a synthetic material Oscorp already developed. It's a smart choice for the character, proving Spider-Man isn't created by the bite alone. Now the spider gives him physical ability, but the shooters come entirely from his own mind. Without that intelligence, this version of the character would feel far less complete, and the devices bring the film closer to the comics, where Peter's greatest asset isn't wall crawling but problem solving under pressure. That said, the film makes the invention a bit too convenient. Peter doesn't create the web fluid himself. Oscorp's already made it. He just finds it, understands its potential, and engineers the delivery mechanism. That's real engineering skill, sure. But it also feels like the screenplay conveniently placed exactly what he needed within easy reach. The same pattern runs through the whole Oscorp storyline. Peter needs access to Connors, and Gwen happens to work there. He needs advanced webbing, and Oscorp already manufactures it. Connors needs the missing equation, and Peter happens to find it among his father's notes. The pieces fit a little too neatly. Oscorp itself ends up feeling less like an ordinary company and more like the secret center of Peter's entire life. His father worked there, Connors works there, Gwen works there, the spider that changed him came from there, the material for his webs comes from there. The tech that created the lizard comes from there. Nearly every road in the story leads back to the same building, which gives the film a sense of cohesion but also makes its world feel smaller and more engineered than organic. The strongest thread here is how Peter's intelligence becomes morally dangerous. When he hands Connors the missing equation, he doesn't fully grasp what he's setting in motion. He's excited to contribute, eager to prove himself, and driven by a need to take part in his father's unfinished work. Then Connors injects himself and becomes the lizard. Peter isn't solely responsible for creating the villain. Of course, Connors makes his own choice, and Oscorp applies its own pressure that rushes the experiment. But Peter still helped make it possible, which adds a real layer to the film's theme of responsibility. His knowledge, not just his powers, can cause damage. Peter is smart enough to change the world before he's mature enough to grasp what the change might cost. There's a genuinely rich story buried in here about inherited ambition. Peter worships his father's unfinished science without understanding why it was abandoned. Connors is desperate to complete it because he believes it can repair the human body. Oscorp sees only commercial and strategic value. Each character approaches the same research for a different reason. And that's a far more interesting conflict than a giant reptile trying to gas New York City. Unfortunately, once Connors transforms, that scientific and emotional nuance gives way to a much more familiar superhero plot. The parent mystery suffers from the same fate. It opens with real intimacy, a child at the top of the stairs, watching his parents leave, expands into secret research and corporate conspiracy, and then stays unresolved because the film is already eyeing its sequels. The post-credits scene makes that intention explicit. A shadowy figure tells Connors the truth about Peter's father is still being withheld. It's meant to build intrigue, but mostly it confirms this movie was never going to provide a complete answer. There's nothing wrong with saving some mystery for later. Franchises can build gradually, but the first installment still needs its loose threads to feel purposeful rather than simply postponed. Here, it often feels less like a carefully designed puzzle and more like a locked box the filmmakers hadn't yet figured out how to open. What rescues the material is how emotionally invested Peter clearly is in it. Garfield plays the parental scenes with a quiet, simmering frustration. Peter isn't just curious, he's hurt. Every new detail draws him closer to his father while also reminding him that his father chose secrecy over staying with him. That contradiction matters. Peter admires Richard's mind but also carries real anger toward him, wants to continue his work even though that same work may be tied to why his family disappeared in the first place. He's trying to build an identity out of someone who left him almost nothing. Science becomes both his inheritance and his wound, which is why the Oscorp storyline works best when it stays close to Peter. The lab, the web shooters, the Connors research all reveal something genuine about him: his intelligence, his recklessness, his need to belong to a history he barely understands. When the film drifts too far into secret company mythology, it becomes far less convincing, with names withheld, motives blurred, and characters appearing only because their real purpose belongs to a future movie. That leaves this chapter feeling unfinished. Still, the underlying idea is a strong one. Peter Parker isn't just a teenager who happens to receive powers. He's a young scientist chasing the trail of his missing father, only to discover that intelligence without caution can be every bit as dangerous as strength without responsibility. The Webb shooters prove what his mind can build. The Lizard proves what that same mind can help unleash. And the unresolved questions about his parents leave him roughly where he started, a closer to the truth, perhaps, but still staring at a door that never fully opens. Casting and performance. Andrew Garfield's casting is probably where this reboot separates itself most clearly from Raimi's films, because his Peter Parker isn't built around softness. Tobey Maguire played Peter as someone the world could push around almost indefinitely. Even after gaining powers, there was still real vulnerability there. Garfield's version carries himself very differently. Restless, defensive, sharper around the edges. You get the sense this Peter has spent years learning to keep people at arm's length, which makes him compelling, if not always immediately likable. The film introduces him as a lonely high schooler, but visually he never quite fades into the background. A tall, effortlessly stylish, riding a skateboard, looking more like the intriguing photography kid than someone nobody notices. That was one of the most common criticisms of the performance. Garfield simply doesn't read as a helpless teenage nerd. He was already in his mid-20s during filming, and it shows in certain scenes. Standing next to the other students, he sometimes looks less like a classmate and more like a young substitute teacher who wandered into the hallway with a backpack. The script tries to compensate by making Peter socially awkward around Gwen, stammering, repeating himself, staring at the floor, folding into himself mid-sentence. Garfield commits fully to those beats, sometimes so intensely that the awkwardness starts to feel performed rather than natural. Even so, he brings a believable nervous energy. His hands move constantly, his eyes keep scanning the room. He starts a thought, changes direction, then tries to cover for what he almost admitted. There's something emotionally unresolved about him, clever enough to grasp complex science, but not always able to voice a simple feeling without it spilling out messily. That contradiction suits this version of the character well. Garfield's Peter reads as guarded rather than timid. He'll confront Flash for humiliating another student, break rules, enter restricted areas, challenge adults he suspects are hiding something. There's plenty of good material here to hold the film together. Garfield and Stone give the dialogue real personality. Martin Sheen adds gravity, the action supplies energy whenever the plot slows down, and Peter's role in Connor's downfall gives the conflict genuine personal stakes. But the script rarely pulls all of that into one clean dramatic through line. It keeps cracking open new doors. Other parents, Oscorp, Norman Osborn, the shadowy figure, the future of the research, the next villain, the next movie. By the time the credits roll, the immediate crisis is resolved, but the film has left so many lights on in other rooms that the ending feels temporary. Maybe that was the intent all along, but The Amazing Spider-Man needed to prove this new version could stand on its own before asking us to invest in everything that comes after it. Instead, the franchise machinery starts running before the first story has properly wrapped up. Direction and tone. Marc Webb was an unconventional pick to direct a Spider-Man movie, and that shows in nearly every frame. Before this, his main credit was 500 Days of Summer, a relationship film built on awkward conversations, romantic uncertainty, and people talking past each other. Nothing about that background obviously points toward giant reptiles, collapsing towers, or a hero swinging through 3D New York City. Yet it makes sense the moment Peter and Gwen are alone together. Webb is clearly far more at ease with two people hesitating in a doorway than with an entire city under siege. He understands nervous attraction, interrupted sentences, and the small shifts in body language that say more than the dialogue itself. The scenes between Garfield and Stone have a looseness the rest of the movie lacks. They breathe. Peter looks away right when he wants to say something honest. Gwen waits, amused but patient. Their conversations are full of pauses, stammers, half-finished thoughts. Not always elegant, but teenage attraction rarely is. and it's where Webb's sensibility comes through most clearly. He seems genuinely more interested in Peter Parker than in Spider-Man. The powers matter, obviously, but the film devotes a surprising amount of time to Peter's loneliness, his anger, his parents, his difficulty connecting with the people closest to him. That focus sets the reboot apart from a straightforward action movie. Peter doesn't just receive abilities and drift toward heroism. Webb treats the powers as something that destabilizes an already unstable teenager, making him more confident but also more reckless, giving him freedom while exposing years of buried anger. The quieter domestic scenes benefit enormously from this approach. Peter's arguments with Uncle Ben feel uncomfortably real. Aunt May watching him limp home injured carries more weight than several of the louder set pieces, and the tense dinner with Captain Stacy generates real friction without a single punch being thrown. The problem is the film can't stay a small character drama forever. Eventually it has to become a $200 million superhero blockbuster. And Webb doesn't seem equally confident in that mode. The action is often technically solid. Spider-Man moves quickly, the camera navigates tricky spaces well, and several fights make good use of his agility. The school battle with the lizard has real energy, and the bridge rescue gives Peter a genuinely meaningful heroic moment. But some of the bigger sequences feel more assembled than directed. Plenty of movement and noise and impressive digital work, but without a strong sense of dramatic shape. A great action scene should tell you something through how it unfolds, building tension with a clear physical idea behind it. Here, the spectacle sometimes feels stitched together from standard modern superhero techniques. Spider-Man swings at the camera, the lizard smashes through walls, objects fly through digital space, the perspective whips around, and then the sequence just ends. Individual shots look excellent, but the scenes don't always add up to something memorable. The film has expensive action without always having distinctive action. That's probably the central tension in Webb's direction. His instincts are personal, but the production surrounding him is enormous. You can picture him drawn to Peter as an abandoned teenager, to Gwen as someone who genuinely sees through him, to Connors as a wounded scientist trying to fix himself. All relationship-driven ideas. But the franchise demands a city-wide threat, visual scale, a climactic tower, sequel setup, a version of Spider-Man familiar enough not to alienate audiences yet fresh enough to justify the reboot. At times the finished film feels like Webb is directing the emotional scenes while a much bigger corporate machine directs everything around them, which gives it an uneven personality. As some passages feel intimate and specific, others could belong to almost any effects-heavy blockbuster from the same era. The personal material wants to slow down, the superhero material keeps pushing toward the next set piece. The film's darker visual tone is part of this attempt at a distinct identity. This Spider-Man exists in a more subdued world than Raimi's, with cooler colors, shadowed interiors, a clinical feeling Oscorp, and wet blue sewer tunnels. Even Peter's home carries a heavier atmosphere. The influence of more grounded superhero filmmaking is obvious. Peter bruises, limps, tears his costume, and moves with a Parker-inspired looseness rather than majestic superhero polish. He doesn't always land cleanly and sometimes has to physically recover mid-motion, which is one of the film's better choices. This Spider-Man is powerful but not yet refined, still figuring out what his body can do, and the movement reflects both his age and his impulsiveness. The technology gets the same grounded treatment. Peter builds practical mechanical shooters, experiments with materials, and his room is stuffed with unfinished gadgets and prototypes, making the suit feel developed rather than magically conjured. Still, all that seriousness can tip into self-consciousness. The film often looks darker than it actually feels. Plenty of blue light, rain, shadow, emotional weight. While the underlying story remains a fairly conventional comic book adventure. That's not inherently a flaw. Spider-Man's identity is rooted in grief and can absolutely carry darkness. The issue is the film sometimes mistakes a serious surface for genuine depth. Dimming the lighting doesn't automatically deepen the parental mystery. Shadowing the lizard doesn't strengthen his motivation. Showing visible injuries doesn't fix logic gaps in the script. The visual mood promises a tougher, more psychologically layered film than the writing consistently delivers, and then Spider-Man starts cracking jokes. That contrast is interesting, if not always smooth. Garfield's Spider-Man is sarcastic, playful, and far more verbally aggressive than Maguire's, toying with criminals and clearly enjoying the freedom of anonymity, one area where the film leans closer to the comics, since Spider-Man really is supposed to be funny, needling villains and masking fear with humor. Garfield's loose physical performance and sharper delivery capture that better than the earlier films often managed. The mechanical web shooters reflect the same comic-accurate instinct, as does the heavier emphasis on Peter's intelligence. He becomes Spider-Man through engineering and observation as much as biology, and his crouched poses and stretched movements recall comic panel artwork directly, occasionally making him look like he's stepped straight out of the page. For longtime readers, those choices signal the filmmakers were genuinely listening to complaints about the earlier trilogy. Peter makes his own webs. Spider-Man jokes constantly. When Stacy is the central love interest, Connors becomes the lizard, and the film seems influenced by the more contemporary Ultimate Spider-Man comics too, with Peter's rebellious streak and the tighter link between his personal life and corporate science. That fidelity is selective, though. The film borrows individual comic elements while reshaping Peter's overall personality. He has the shooters and the jokes, but he isn't the socially invisible, financially strained Peter some fans expect. Which raises a real question. What does faithfulness actually mean here? Is it the costume, the gadgets, the supporting cast, the exact personality, the moral center? A film can nail surface details while feeling emotionally different from its source, or change major elements while preserving the character's underlying spirit. Webb's version does a bit of both. His Peter is scientifically gifted, burdened by guilt, and gradually learning a responsibility that feels recognizably Spider-Man, while also being stylish, confident, and occasionally abrasive in ways that feel like a deliberate reinvention rather than a faithful translation. That mix will land better for some viewers than others. There are also moments where the push for comic accuracy clashes with the grounded tone. Mechanical web shooters make sense as proof of Peter's intelligence, but the synthetic fluid happens to be conveniently available at Oscorp. The wisecracks suit Spider-Man, but occasionally feel out of place in scenes shot like a dark urban thriller. The lizard comes straight from the comics, yet his city-wide scheme is exactly the kind of exaggerated villain plot the rest of the film seems to be avoiding. The movie wants realism and comic book scale simultaneously, and sometimes that combination clicks. The bridge rescue is visually spectacular but emotionally simple, staying focused on one frightened child. Other times the balance falls apart entirely, and the climax turns into machinery, gas clouds, and digital destruction, leaving the quieter ideas behind. Webb's best instinct is centering the story on Peter's emotional life. Even when the plot gets crowded, it keeps circling back to abandonment. His parents leaving, Uncle Ben dying, Aunt May unable to reach him, Connors becoming a failed link to his father, Gwen as one of the few people he actually chooses to trust. That gives the reboot a consistent emotional through line, even if the plot doesn't always handle it cleanly. The weaker choice is trying to wrap that through line inside franchise planning before the first film has even finished establishing itself. You can sense multiple creative voices at work. 3 credited writers, a studio already mapping sequels, a reboot that has to satisfy comic fans while still appealing to viewers who only know Raimi's films. The result sometimes feels negotiated. One scene is romantic, the next grim, then a joke, then a pause for parental mystery, then the lizard returns and a building starts collapsing. It never becomes incoherent, but the tone never fully settles either. Raimi's films, whatever their flaws, had a recognizable personality. A sentimental, strange, colorful, occasionally campy, with the director's particular taste visible in the performances, humor, and visual exaggeration. Webb's film is more polished and far less eccentric, which makes it easier to take seriously in places but harder to genuinely love in others. There's no shortage of craft, the personal scenes are well directed, Spider-Man moves beautifully, the world feels detailed, and the desire to modernize the character is obvious throughout. What's missing is the sense that every piece belongs to one unified creative vision. Webb clearly brings real sensitivity to Peter Parker, and that shouldn't be undersold. The romance works largely because he understands it. The family conflict has real texture, and Garfield gets to play Peter as messy rather than purely heroic. But once the film expands into spectacle, Webb's individual voice gets harder to hear. The moments that stick aren't necessarily the biggest ones. A Peter struggling to talk to Gwen, Uncle Ben trying to explain obligation without repeating the famous line, Aunt May quietly realizing Peter's been hurt, Spider-Man handing his mask to a frightened kid. Those scenes have clarity because they're about people. The larger franchise material, by comparison, often feels like obligation. So Webb's direction isn't a failure, it's a partial success trapped inside a production that demands he be several different filmmakers at once. He handles the teenager well, he handles the romance well, he handles quiet grief well. It's the enormous superhero machinery where the film becomes less personal, less confident, and much more generic. Action and visual style. Whatever else you can say about The Amazing Spider-Man, it knows how to make Spider-Man move, and that's probably the clearest improvement over the earlier films. The swinging carries real weight, speed, and a genuine sense of distance. Spider-Man doesn't just glide through a blurred New York backdrop, he seems to travel through actual physical space. You feel the drop beneath him as the camera follows his fall, catches the moment a web line goes taut, and sends him rocketing forward again. There's a natural rhythm to it, almost like controlled panic. For the first time in a Spider-Man film, swinging occasionally feels less like flying and more like falling very successfully, which makes the action genuinely more thrilling. Garfield's build helps sell it. He's long, lean, and flexible, so this Spider-Man doesn't move like a heavyweight brawler. He folds into unusual positions, crouches low, twists mid-air, relies on momentum rather than brute force, giving him an appropriately insect-like quality. Even in fully digital shots, the movement usually stays tethered to Garfield's physical performance. Spider-Man lands awkwardly, scrambles across walls, sometimes looks like he's still deciding what to do mid-motion. He's fast but not elegant yet, which fits an inexperienced hero perfectly. The film also uses plenty of point-of-view shots to pull the audience deeper into the swinging, clearly designed with 3D and IMAX screenings in mind. The camera plunges between buildings, rushes toward glass, dives into open air. Some of it feels a little obvious, like the film is announcing that you're supposed to lean back in your seat, but the effect still works, even in standard 2D. The level of detail is genuinely impressive. Reflections ripple across Spider-Man's suit, buildings pass with convincing depth, and the city feels large enough that crossing it should actually be difficult. That scale matters, because New York isn't just backdrop in a Spider-Man story, it's the space his powers were built for. On the ground, Peter is awkward and emotionally boxed in above the streets. Everything opens up. The costume design reinforces that physical identity. It's textured, narrow, and built around Garfield's frame, with long limbs and an unconventional pattern that make this Spider-Man read as younger and less established than the version audiences already knew. Not everyone loved the design. Parts of it feel a little busy in still images, but once the character's actually moving, it works better than it looks on the poster. The suit stretches naturally with him, and the reflective lenses give his masked face enough subtle expression to stay readable mid-fight. The blend of practical and digital work pays off in several standout sequences. Peter discovering his powers on the subway plays mostly for comedy, but it also establishes the physical rules. He can't control what he touches, his reflexes outrun his judgment. Every movement carries an accidental consequence. The skateboarding sequence, while a slightly forced attempt at modern flavor, still communicates the idea effectively as physical storytelling. He's learning to live inside a new body. The bridge rescue is where his abilities first turn genuinely heroic, full of spectacle, falling cars, webs, height, and chaos, but never losing focus on one frightened child. Spider-Man can't punch his way through this problem. He has to stay calm and help someone else stay calm, which makes the scene land harder than some of the bigger battles. When Peter hands over his mask, the effects briefly take a backseat to raw emotion, technology supporting the moment rather than replacing it. The later fights are less consistent. The sewer showdown with the lizard has real atmosphere, dark, cramped, tilted in the creature's favor, with Spider-Man forced onto enemy turf instead of waiting in an open arena. The school battle is more playful, making clever use of corridors, walls, and shifting levels. Spider-Man doesn't fight like a boxer. He improvises with ceilings, webbing, and whatever's within reach, which is exactly how his action scenes should work. The Oscorp Tower climax delivers the expected scale but feels far more generic. A machine, a countdown, a dangerous substance, a city-wide threat. Functional blockbuster construction with diminishing distinctiveness. The bigger the scene gets, the less it stands out. Spider-Man and the lizard crash through digital environments, chunks of the building break apart, the camera whips around them, and despite the technically massive stakes, the sequence somehow feels safer than several smaller moments earlier in the film. The outcome never feels seriously in doubt. The lizard is strong enough to toss Peter around, but the fight lacks the emotional history to make individual hits really matter. Peter helped create this crisis, and Connors knew his father, but that relationship stays underdeveloped, so the climax delivers motion without quite delivering tragedy. The crane sequence lands somewhere between inspired and a little silly. Spider-Man, wounded, is struggling to reach Oscorp when a construction worker recognizes him as the man who saved his son and rallies nearby crane operators to line their machines up so Peter can swing across the city. It's pure comic book sentimentality, and there's something genuinely likable about it. Ordinary people helping the hero because the hero helped them first, the city itself becoming part of Spider-Man's recovery. That's a strong emotional beat. It's also wildly convenient how the cranes swing into perfect position with suspicious speed, as if the entire skyline reorganized itself for one injured teenager. If the rest of the film leaned more openly into heightened comic logic, the moment might pass without friction because the reboot keeps insisting on realism elsewhere. The convenience is harder to overlook. Still, James Horner's score pushes the sequence forward with enough sincerity to nearly get away with it. The music overall is a mixed bag. Horner brings scale, emotion, and a real sense of wonder to parts of the film. His work during the swinging sequences gives them lift, and the quieter themes underline Peter's loneliness without tipping into melodrama. At other points, though, the score reaches for grandeur before the scene has earned it, swelling as if trying to convince the audience something important is happening. Compared to Danny Elfman's work on the Raimi films, Horner's score is less immediately memorable. Elfman's themes carried a strange gothic energy that felt specifically bound to Spider-Man, while Horner's music is effective in the moment but easier to forget once the credits roll. The cinematography carries a similar mix of strengths and weaknesses. John Schwartzman gives the film a polished, darker look. Oscorp reads as cold and metallic, the sewers wet and shadowed, Peter's home warmer but still subdued, and New York at night feels genuinely dangerous without tipping into full stylization. The cooler palette clearly separates this version from Raimi's brighter, more comic booky world. Sometimes it's genuinely striking, other times it feels like seriousness applied as a filter, everything darker and bluer simply because the film wants to be taken as grounded. Even while the plot still involves a giant reptile trying to transform all of New York via a machine on top of a skyscraper. There's nothing inherently wrong with that combination, but the visual realism occasionally sits a little awkwardly next to the material's natural absurdity. The production design handles that balance more gracefully. Peter's bedroom is cluttered with cameras, scientific gear, posters, and half-finished projects, clearly shaped by a specific kid's personality. The Parker house feels lived in and warm. Midtown High reads as modern without tipping into anything futuristic, while Oscorp feels advanced enough to suggest work well beyond public knowledge. The sewer sets are less subtle but do their job, giving the lizard an appropriately grim home base. There's a genuine level of craftsmanship on display throughout, which is exactly why calling the film simply bad never quite feels fair. The effects are frequently excellent, the cast is strong, the physical portrayal of Spider-Man is energetic and convincing, and certain action beats understand the character deeply. The film's weaknesses don't stem from laziness, they stem from a lack of unity. The personal scenes belong to a thoughtful teen drama. The visuals belong to a darker superhero reboot. The humor belongs to a more playful Spider-Man adventure. The climax belongs to a standard summer blockbuster. The sequel setup belongs to a corporate franchise plan. All of these movies exist inside the same runtime, and they don't always get along. Comparisons to Raimi's trilogy are unavoidable. His first two films had real flaws, but also an unmistakable personality, a sentimental, colorful, strange, occasionally ridiculous, with broad but sincere emotion running through it. The Amazing Spider-Man is more controlled, smoother effects, a more agile Spider-Man, a more natural romance, greater emphasis on Peter's scientific mind, and comic-accurate touches like the web shooters and sharper humor. Technically, it improves on plenty. Emotionally, it doesn't always improve the experience. Maguire's Peter carried an immediate vulnerability Garfield's version sometimes lacks. Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin and Alfred Molina's Doc Ock had far stronger personalities than the Lizard ever gets. Elfman's score was more distinctive, and Raimi's action often felt tied to his own idiosyncratic visual imagination. Webb's film is polished but noticeably less personal once the spectacle takes over. Set against films like Iron Man, The Avengers, or Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, the reboot also struggles to define its own identity. Those films arrived with sharp, clear purposes, reshaping the tone of superhero cinema or delivering scale audiences hadn't seen before. The Amazing Spider-Man lands somewhere in between movements, reaching for Batman's grounded seriousness, modern Marvel's sarcastic energy, and the emotional pull of an established franchise all at once. It does each of those things reasonably well without fully owning any of them. None of that erases the film's entertainment value. Once Spider-Man is fully up and running, there's plenty to like. The movement is exciting, Garfield brings genuine charisma to the mask, Emma Stone brings warmth, Martin Sheen anchors the early story emotionally, and the film is easy enough to watch start to finish. The tougher question is what it leaves behind afterward. For devoted fans, the comic-accurate touches are the mechanical shooters, a more talkative hero, Gwen Stacy, the Lizard might be enough to offer a version of the mythology the earlier films never got around to providing. For more casual viewers, the whole experience might feel like an expensive rerun with a different cast.